The HOA president called 911 to shut down my illegal floating lake party and demanded my arrest. So I showed them my federal Coast Guard permit signed by an admiral. 20 minutes later, a Coast Guard commander escorted the humiliated HOA president off my federally authorized training waters. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. They called 911 to shut down my floating lake party for illegal water activities. I called my federal supervisor to explain why local cops were trying to arrest a Coast Guard officer conducting authorized maritime operations. The confrontation started at exactly 2:47 p.m. on what should have been a perfect Saturday afternoon. I was hosting my annual 4th of July floating party, 20 boats tied together in the middle of Crystal Lake, barbecues smoking on floating platforms, kids jumping off diving boards, and classic rock echoing across the water. That's when I heard the bullhorn cutting through the music like a chainsaw. Attention all watercraft. You are conducting illegal activities on restricted waters. Disperse immediately or face arrest. I looked up from my floating grill to see 3 police boats approaching our party flotilla, lights flashing like we were running drugs instead of hosting a family barbecue. Behind them I could see more patrol cars lining the shoreline. The lead boat pulled alongside my pontoon, and out stepped a woman in a crisp white uniform who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Behind her stood a man in an expensive suit who definitely didn't belong on a police boat. "I'm Officer Martinez with the Lake County Water Patrol," the woman announced. "This is Richard Blackstone, HOA president of Lakeside Estates. We've received complaints about unauthorized commercial water activities in violation of local ordinances." I set down my spatula and looked at this Richard Blackstone character, who was standing on a police boat like he owned it. Commercial activities? This is a private party for friends and family. 20 boats tied together conducting organized water sports is a commercial operation, Blackstone declared, pulling out his phone to record everything. "You're operating without proper permits, violating noise ordinances, and creating safety hazards that threaten our property values." That's when I realized this guy had no idea what he was walking into. "Sir, could I see some identification?" Officer Martinez asked, clearly trying to do her job professionally despite being used as Blackstone's personal enforcement squad. I pulled out my wallet and handed her my driver's license along with another card that made her eyes widen. "Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, United States Coast Guard," she read aloud, then looked up at me with new understanding. Blackstone snatched the ID from her hands. "I don't care if you're the President of the United States. This water activity violates our community standards and local regulations." "Mr. Blackstone," I said calmly, "before you threaten a federal officer, perhaps you should understand what authority governs these waters. Local HOA regulations govern all water activities that affect our community," he replied with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. "I've shut down 6 illegal water parties this summer, and yours is number 7. That's when I pulled out the document that would change everything. "Officer Martinez, this is my federal permit for maritime training operations on Crystal Lake, signed by Admiral Richardson of the 5th Coast Guard District." Officer Martinez examined the permit, and I watched her face change as she read the official language authorizing multi-vessel coordination exercises, water safety training and emergency response drills on Crystal Lake between May 1st and September 30th. "Mr. Blackstone," she said carefully, "this appears to be a federal permit for the exact activities we're observing." Blackstone grabbed the permit and studied it like he was examining evidence of fraud. "This is fake. Nobody gets federal permits for private parties." "You're right," I said with a smile. "Nobody gets federal permits for private parties. But Coast Guard officers get federal permits for training exercises that involve civilian volunteers in maritime safety operations. This is a barbecue party, not a training exercise. Actually, it's both. Every person on these boats is participating in a Coast Guard water safety demonstration. We're testing emergency evacuation procedures, multi-vessel coordination, and civilian rescue techniques." I gestured toward the organized chaos around us. "Those kids jumping off the diving board? They're practicing emergency water entry. The boats tied together? That's multi-vessel coordination training. The floating platforms? Emergency staging areas for maritime rescue operations." Officer Martinez was clearly trying not to smile. "Sir, is this an official Coast Guard operation?" "Absolutely. Every activity here is covered under federal maritime training regulations. Mr. Blackstone's HOA has zero authority over federal water operations." Blackstone's face was turning red. "This is ridiculous. You can't claim a party is a federal operation just because you're in the military. I'm not claiming anything, I replied, pulling out my radio. Coast Guard Station Hampton, this is Lieutenant Commander Morrison requesting confirmation of authorized training operation on Crystal Lake. The radio crackled to life immediately. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, you are confirmed for multi-vessel training exercises on Crystal Lake through 1800 hours today. Is there a problem with your operation? Local authorities are questioning our federal permit. Could you confirm our authorization? Roger that. All activities at your location are federally authorized under Coast Guard training protocols. Any interference with your operation should be reported immediately. The silence that followed was beautiful. Officer Martinez looked like she wanted to disappear, and Blackstone looked like he'd just swallowed a live fish. Mr. Blackstone, Officer Martinez said slowly, it appears this is a legitimate federal operation that we have no authority to shut down. That's impossible, he sputtered. HOA regulations clearly state. HOA regulations don't supersede federal authority, I interrupted. This is navigable water under federal jurisdiction, and my permit gives me exclusive use of this area for training operations. This is still a noise violation, Blackstone insisted desperately. Your music is disturbing our peaceful community. I pointed to a section of my permit. Federal training operations are exempt from local noise ordinances when conducted during authorized hours. We're within those parameters. That's when Blackstone made the mistake that guaranteed his humiliation. Officer Martinez, I demand you arrest this man for impersonating a federal officer and falsifying government documents. The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Officer Martinez stared at Blackstone like he'd lost his mind. Sir, you're asking me to arrest a Coast Guard officer for conducting federally authorized operations. I'm asking you to arrest a civilian who's lying about being military to avoid HOA regulations. I pulled out my phone and made the call that would end Richard Blackstone's harassment campaign forever. Admiral Richardson's office, this is Lieutenant Commander Morrison. I need to report civilian interference with authorized Coast Guard training operations. Yes, sir, someone is claiming our federal permits are fake and demanding local arrest of Coast Guard personnel. I put the call on speaker so everyone could hear. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, this is Admiral Richardson. Are local authorities interfering with your training operation? Yes, sir. An HOA president named Richard Blackstone is claiming our federal permits are fraudulent and demanding my arrest for impersonating a federal officer. The Admiral's voice turned ice cold. Put Mr. Blackstone on the phone immediately. I handed my phone to Blackstone, who suddenly looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. This is Richard Blackstone, he said weakly. Mr. Blackstone, this is Admiral Richardson, 5th Coast Guard District. You are interfering with a federal maritime training operation conducted under my direct authority. Are you claiming that Coast Guard permits signed by me are fraudulent? I was just trying to enforce community standards. Are you accusing a Coast Guard admiral of issuing fake permits? No, sir, I just thought. Mr. Blackstone, interfering with federal maritime operations is a federal crime. I suggest you cease your harassment of my personnel immediately and apologize for questioning federal authority. The phone went dead, leaving Blackstone standing in complete silence while 20 boats full of people stared at him. Officer Martinez cleared her throat. Mr. Blackstone, I think we should leave these folks alone to conduct their federal training operation. But Blackstone wasn't finished destroying his own credibility. This is still an HOA violation, he declared, his voice cracking with desperation. Our community covenants prohibit organized water activities regardless of federal permits. Sir, Officer Martinez said carefully, federal law supersedes HOA covenants. We cannot enforce local rules against federal operations. Then I'll file complaints with the county, the state, and the federal government until someone shuts down this noise pollution. That's when I decided Richard Blackstone needed a lesson in federal authority that he'd never forget. Mr. Blackstone, since you're so concerned about federal regulations, let me explain something. This lake is classified as navigable water under federal jurisdiction. My permit doesn't just authorize training operations, it gives me exclusive use of this water area during authorized hours. What does that mean? It means every boat on this lake right now is here under my authority, including yours. Officer Martinez's eyes widened as she realized the implications. Are you saying the police boat needs permission to be here? During my authorized training hours, all watercraft in this area operate under Coast Guard authority. Mr. Blackstone's presence on a police boat in my training zone without permission could be considered interference with federal operations. Blackstone looked around desperately. You can't control police boats with a party permit. This isn't a party permit. It's a federal maritime operations authorization that grants exclusive water use during specified hours. Read Section 4B. Officer Martinez read the relevant section and looked up with obvious concern. Mr. Blackstone, it appears we're technically operating in restricted federal waters without authorization. This is insane, Blackstone shouted. You cannot shut down police boats for an HOA complaint. I'm not shutting down anything, I replied calmly. I'm simply explaining that your complaint has brought a police boat into restricted federal waters during an active Coast Guard operation. The Admiral might have questions about that. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Blackstone had used his HOA position to convince local police to interfere with federal maritime operations, potentially creating an incident between local and federal law enforcement. Officer Martinez, I said, I suggest you contact your supervisor and explain the situation before this becomes an interagency incident. She was already reaching for her radio when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Admiral Richardson. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, I've just received a call from the Federal Maritime Authority about interference with your training operation. Are local police still harassing your personnel? I looked at Officer Martinez, who was frantically trying to explain the situation to her dispatcher, and Blackstone, who looked like he wanted to jump overboard. The situation is resolving itself, sir. Local law enforcement is beginning to understand federal jurisdiction issues. Good. I'm sending Commander Phillips to observe the remainder of your training operation and ensure no further interference occurs. Thank you, sir. 20 minutes later, a Coast Guard patrol boat arrived with Commander Phillips aboard. The sight of federal maritime law enforcement backing up my operation was the final nail in Blackstone's harassment campaign. Commander Phillips pulled alongside the police boat and addressed Officer Martinez directly. Officer, I understand there's been some confusion about federal maritime operations. Let me clarify, Lieutenant Commander Morrison is conducting authorized Coast Guard training under federal permit. Local authorities have no jurisdiction over these operations. Yes, sir, we understand now, Officer Martinez replied, clearly eager to end this nightmare. Commander Phillips then turned to Blackstone with the kind of stare that made civilian troublemakers reconsider their life choices. Mr. Blackstone, I'm told you've accused Coast Guard personnel of fraud and demanded arrest of federal officers. Is that correct? I was just trying to enforce HOA regulations, Blackstone mumbled. HOA regulations do not override federal maritime law. Your interference with authorized Coast Guard operations could result in federal charges. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Good. I suggest you leave federal waters immediately and avoid any future interference with Coast Guard personnel or operations. The police boats departed within 5 minutes, leaving our floating party to continue under federal protection. But the real entertainment was just beginning. Word of Blackstone's confrontation with the Coast Guard spread through lakeside estates like wildfire. By evening, every resident knew their HOA president had tried to arrest a Coast Guard officer and been humiliated by an admiral. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for the following Tuesday, and I decided to attend as a concerned community member. The community center was packed with angry residents who'd heard various versions of the story. Blackstone stood at the front of the room looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. As you may have heard, he began weakly, there was an incident on Saturday involving unauthorized water activities. You mean when you tried to arrest a Coast Guard officer? Someone shouted from the back. The situation was more complicated than initial reports suggested, Blackstone replied, his voice getting smaller. That's when I stood up and introduced myself. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Lieutenant Commander Morrison, the Coast Guard officer involved in Saturday's incident. I'd like to clarify what actually happened. The room fell silent as I explained the federal permit, the training operation, and Blackstone's attempt to have me arrested for conducting authorized Coast Guard activities. Mr. Blackstone accused me of impersonating a federal officer, claimed my permits were fraudulent, and demanded local police arrest me for conducting operations authorized by a Coast Guard admiral. The murmur from the crowd was audible and angry. Furthermore, I continued, his interference with federal maritime operations could have resulted in serious legal consequences for your entire community. Blackstone tried to defend himself. I was protecting our community's interests from disruptive activities. You were interfering with federal law enforcement training, I corrected. The Coast Guard was testing emergency response procedures that could save lives in this community. An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. Are you saying our HOA president tried to shut down Coast Guard training? That's exactly what I'm saying. And when a Coast Guard admiral called to explain federal authority, Mr. Blackstone continued to argue that HOA rules supersede federal maritime law. The room erupted. Residents who'd elected Blackstone to protect their interests discovered he'd nearly created a federal incident that could have brought unwanted government attention to their community. The vote of no confidence was unanimous. Blackstone was removed as HOA president and banned from holding any future board positions. But the consequences didn't end there. The story of an HOA president trying to arrest a Coast Guard officer made national news, turning Blackstone into a symbol of HOA overreach and entitled civilian interference with military operations. The video of him arguing with Admiral Richardson went viral with hashtags like #HOA Karen and #Coast Guard vs. Karen, generating millions of views and making Blackstone a national laughingstock. Property values in lakeside estates dropped as potential buyers avoided a community known for harassing military personnel. Blackstone's own house went on the market within a month, eventually selling at a $150,000 loss when buyers learned about his confrontation with federal authorities. 6 months later, I was preparing for my annual 4th of July floating party when the new HOA president stopped by my house. "Commander Morrison," she said respectfully, "the board wanted to personally invite you to use our community dock for your Coast Guard training operations. We're honored to support military training in our community." "Thank you. That's much more welcoming than last year's reception. We learned our lesson about interfering with federal operations. Mr. Blackstone's behavior was embarrassing for our entire community." "What happened to him?" "He moved to Florida. Apparently he's having trouble finding HOA positions after the national news coverage." The next morning brought perfect weather for my floating party. As I was setting up the barbecue platforms, I noticed a familiar Coast Guard patrol boat approaching. Commander Phillips pulled alongside my pontoon with a grin. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison, requesting permission to join your training operation." "Permission granted, sir. What brings you out here?" "Admiral Richardson wanted me to personally ensure no local authorities interfere with today's operation. Also, my family loves barbecue." As boats began arriving for the party, training operation, I reflected on the lessons of the past year. Sometimes entitled people mistake civilian authority for federal jurisdiction, and sometimes that mistake becomes a very public education. Richard Blackstone had tried to use HOA power to shut down Coast Guard training operations. Instead, he'd learned that federal maritime law doesn't care about community covenants, and admirals don't appreciate civilian interference with military operations. The floating party was perfect that year. 20 boats, perfect weather, excellent barbecue, and the knowledge that anyone who tried to shut us down would be explaining themselves to federal authorities. As the sun set over Crystal Lake, painting the water gold and orange, I stood on my floating platform surrounded by friends, family, and fellow service members. The music was playing, kids were laughing, and everyone was enjoying the kind of perfect summer day that makes all the training and preparation worthwhile. My radio crackled with a message from Coast Guard Station Hampton. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison, training operation appears highly successful. Recommend continuation of civilian maritime safety program." "Roger that," I replied, raising my beer in a toast to federal authority and the power of proper permits. Sometimes the best defense against harassment is simply knowing your rights and having the documentation to prove them. Richard Blackstone learned that lesson the hard way, in front of a Coast Guard admiral and a room full of his own neighbors. The training operation continues every 4th of July, now with full community support and federal backing. The barbecue gets better every year, and nobody has tried to shut us down since Admiral Richardson explained federal maritime jurisdiction to the last guy who tried. Federal permits, they're not just for parties, they're for making sure the parties never end.